Hello everyone, my name is Jordan Webb, and for my team project I will be analyzing the Capital One data breach. So to introduce the agenda of topics that I will talk about over this presentation, I will briefly go over the overview of the attack. I will take a technical deep dive into what exactly happened, provide some lessons learned, as well as introduce some prevention methods that could have been implemented to prevent the attack. So what exactly happened? Well, in July of 2019, Capital One announced to the public that an individual had gained access to their systems and obtained personal information that affected around 106 million people and caused about $250 million worth of damage. And this attack was actually planned and executed by just one single person. It was a software engineer by the name of Paige Thompson. Who is Paige Thompson? Well, as I mentioned just a minute ago, she was a software engineer and she had previously worked for Amazon prior to the attack. And that's worth mentioning because the systems that were compromised by Capital One were actually hosted on AWS servers. So it's assumed that she noticed these vulnerabilities as an employee and then chose to exploit them rather than notify Capital One as well as other customers of the potential issues that they might see. She built her own custom tool that would scan AWS systems for misconfigured firewalls, which would permit commands to pass through them and would allow them to be executed on the servers that were behind the firewalls. How did she do it? So Thompson's script had 3 steps that were executed in order to retrieve the data. First, it would obtain security credentials. It would then list the directories that were in the storage spaces and then copy the data back to external systems. She was able to gain access to the server through a vulnerability known as server-side request forgery, or also just SSRF for short. So SSRF is a vulnerability that allows an attacker to force an application running on a server to make requests and connect to other services that are in the organization's infrastructure. It may also force a server to connect to external systems, which has the ability to leak data such as authorization credentials. Through the combination of the SSRF attack and the misconfigured firewall that allowed remote execution of commands, Thompson was able to obtain an access key ID and a secret key. Using these temporary credentials, she was able to run commands on the AWS servers with APIs. She repeatedly issued the common ls linux command to list the AWS data buckets, and finally she was able to use an AWS sync command that would allow her to copy around 30 gigabytes worth of Capital One credit application data back to her local machine. So by doing this, she was able to compromise 30 accounts, one of which obviously belonging to Capital One, and ultimately she ended up being criminally charged for all 30 accounts. In addition to that, she also stole some compute power from some accounts by installing crypto mining software on their servers and then sending the profits straight back to her own bank account. What was her downfall? So Thompson attempted to hide her location through the use of a VPN and the anonymous Tor network to access the servers. She foolishly gave herself away though by bragging on GitHub that she had stolen Capital One data. An anonymous user saw her comments talking about how she had stolen the data and saw her strip that she had posted up on her GitHub and then reported it to Capital One. So once Capital One saw the report, they immediately reported it to the FBI and Thompson was arrested shortly after. What could have prevented this? Investigating this incident shows us a few ways that the attack could have been prevented and offers some insight for organizations to learn from to be sure that they don't fall victim to the same type of attack. So to begin, you should always know and understand your infrastructure, such as what users or roles can access what information and whether or not that makes sense for what you're doing. In Capital One's case, their web application firewall had permissions to access and download private customer information, so you have to ask yourself, is that really necessary and should that have ever been configured that way in the first place? And the answer is probably not. In addition to understanding your infrastructure, you should also apply the principle of least privilege. So this is just where users only have access to resources that they absolutely need to in order to perform their job. Another policy to follow is separating your resources. So Capital One held both its web application firewall, and sensitive customer data on the same server. So this is obviously not good practice for obvious reasons. And finally, you should keep your infrastructure up to date. So this means patching security vulnerabilities and keeping track of updates for software that you have installed, as well as operating system upgrades. So Thompson knew the public IP of the Capital One system, and she was able to access it, and tools such as CloudFront, which is offered by AWS, block suspicious requests before they reach servers. So Capital One wasn't using this, but had they been using it, it likely would have blocked Thompson from accessing the server and would have prevented the attack altogether. So this is a perfect example of why it's important to stay up to date with the latest technologies and security recommendations. Monitoring for unauthorized personnel, connections, devices, and software is also critical. Had this been a part of Capital One's monitoring plan, they most likely would have noticed connections from an unrecognized source coming from the Tor network. They would probably also noticed it copying 30 gigabytes worth of data from their hosted servers. So back to SSRF that we talked about a few slides ago, these attacks are known vulnerabilities, and as such there are defenses that can be set up to defend against them. These attacks can be mitigated with the use of a properly configured web application firewall and vulnerability scanners. There are a few key takeaways that we can learn from this incident, and I will go into each of them in more detail on the next slide. So we must always stay current, always understand the systems that we secure, and make sure that we are aware of common vulnerabilities. Another great tool that we can use and should always use is effective monitoring and alerting solutions so that we know when things go wrong. From all this information, we can learn a lot and use it moving forward. As security professionals, we are required to stay current with all the latest vulnerabilities. Cybersecurity is an ever-growing field, and each day new vulnerabilities are discovered, so we can't rely on gathering knowledge in school and then never expecting to change our ways. We must always stay on top of the systems that we maintain and the potential threats that they may be vulnerable to. To conclude, information systems offer us numerous services in our daily lives to make things easier for us. All these services, though, can come with a hefty price if our personal information gets into the wrong hands. Because of this, qualified cybersecurity professionals are absolutely necessary in protecting these systems from vulnerabilities and attackers that have the goal of profiting off of the information that they can steal. Here are my sources, and thank you for watching.